Hello, welcome to Topic 8. In Topic 8, we're going to be looking at water balance and also the role of electrolytes. Okay, we can find some further information in Chapter 13, Waterworks, and also Chapter 12, Water and the Major Minerals in Understanding Nutrition. So the main areas we need to focus on is initially what sort of disorders can happen if the water is out of balance and the electrolytes are out of balance. We'll look at all the various functions that water has in the body. We'll look at the typical water intake and water output. We'll look at what they mean by daily adequate water intake. So it's roughly about 2.5 litres a day. We'll look at the role of electrolytes and that link between excessive sodium intake and hypertension. Okay, water is an essential nutrient. If you don't have water, you're likely to end up dying within about a week compared to without food. So without food, you can last a number of weeks, maybe months. And without vitamins and certain minerals, again, you can last weeks or months. So here's an example of a person who had no food for 2 months, but obviously had access to water by melting the snow. And he was able to survive for 2 months until he was rescued. And there's a short video showing that. Okay, if our water balance is not right, or if our electrolyte balance is out of whack, there's a number of disorders that can arise. So we can end up with dehydration, heat stroke. You can have too much water and you can end up with water intoxication. Too much of electrolytes like sodium, we can end up with hypertension, or we can end up with muscle disorders. So if we don't replace the water that's lost, dehydration can result. And this can sometimes happen when it's very hot, or if you're doing very heavy exercise, you can actually lose excessive amounts of water. Also, infants and the elderly are actually more prone to dehydration. So during dehydration, initially what might happen is you might just be a bit tired, a bit thirsty. If you end up losing 4% of your body fluid, you could end up with loss of muscle strength. If you lose up to 10%, you become very, very weak. And if you lose up to 20% of your body fluid, that can actually result in death. So here's an example of a person that has died as a result of dehydration. So they must have lost at least 20% of their body fluid. And over a period of 7 days, the person's actually ended up dying. So again, we've got some short videos you can have a look at later on. Right, so some of the people most at risk of dehydration are the elderly. As you become older, you start to lose your sense of thirst, and so it doesn't trigger your need to actually start to replace lost fluids. People that are suffering illness, so food poisoning, will have a lot of diarrhea, a lot of vomiting, so you're losing a lot of body fluid, particularly dangerous for young children and athletes who are undergoing very vigorous exercise, again, could be losing a lot of water. Okay, if we don't get our water balance right, another problem that can occur is heat stroke. And there's been cases where people have died, particularly examples with athletes exercising in extreme heat have resulted in heat stroke and death. So here's an example of an American gridiron player exercising extreme heat at 35 degrees. His body temperature raised to 42.2 degrees, and as a result of that excessive heat, the athlete died. So when you get a chance, you can watch this short video. So the opposite to dehydration can occur. So we can actually become overhydrated if we're consuming too much water. And what can happen, that can cause problems for the kidneys, problems with having too much water in our blood vessels, which will dilute out the sodium in the blood vessels. And that can have consequences in that it can cause mild symptoms like dizziness, headache, all the way through very severe symptoms such as seizure and death. So in this example, we can see a marathon runner suffered overhydration, so trying to compensate for, while trying to prevent dehydration, so he overconsumed water, and that resulted in her falling into a coma and eventually leading to her death as a result of hyponatremia, where she had very low sodium in her blood system. Okay, in some individuals, a lack of electrolyte balance, in particular a lack of sodium balance, having too much sodium can actually lead to problems such as hypertension, which is results in high blood pressure. So you've got systolic pressure over 140 and diastolic over 90. and that can increase a person's risk of heart disease, stroke, and kidney disease. So in this table, we can see normal blood pressure, and we can also the levels for hypertension. So here we can see that there is a link between high consumption of salt and hypertension, but it's not always the case. So you can see here in 95% of the cases, they're not really sure what has actually resulted in the person suffering hypertension. Okay, one function of electrolytes is to help our nervous systems work correctly. So if the electrolytes are out of balance, it'll cause the nervous systems to not work correctly, which can actually then lead to muscle disorders such as muscle cramps. Okay, next we're going to look at the various functions water has in our bodies. So water acts as what's called the universal solvent. It is involved in transporting nutrients through the blood vessels, removing waste materials through the kidneys, helps maintain the correct blood pressure, helps maintain correct body temperature through perspiration, is involved in chemical reactions. So there's some hydrolysis reactions that require water as part of the reaction. It acts as a lubricant, particularly around the knee joints and elbows, acts as a shock absorber around your spine, around your eye sockets. So an important function of water is that it acts as a universal solvent. So components that are water soluble are carried via the bloodstream. So you can see here the blood is actually about 92% water. So water soluble nutrients such as glucose, various minerals, whether it's salt, potassium, the water soluble vitamins, things like vitamin C, they're all carried via the blood, dissolved in the water, and it goes to the various cells that need those particular nutrients and those particular minerals and vitamins. And then waste products are also carried via the bloodstream to the kidney, and then things like urea and carbon dioxide are dissolved in that bloodstream and go via the kidneys out into the waste products. So in this diagram, we can see the role of water is playing in our blood vessels, helping to move required nutrients such as glucose, amino acids, minerals to our cells, and also helping to remove waste products such as carbon dioxide and other waste products away from the cells to the kidneys to be eliminated. All right, so without sufficient water, we can get a buildup of urea and sodium, and that can actually result in kidney stones. Over here's a kidney stone. A few years ago, I actually had problems with kidney stones, ended up in the emergency department of the hospital, and the female doctor there told me, well, that's as close as I'm going to find out what the pain of what a labour pain actually feels like. The pain of the kidney stones was very similar. All right, so water plays a very important role in helping us to regulate our body temperature. So via perspiration, via sweat, as that water is evaporating away, it has a cooling effect and helps us prevent problems such as heat stroke. So with heat stroke, if your body actually gets above 41 degrees, it's going to cause permanent damage to your enzymes, to your tissues, which can actually result in death. So in this diagram here, we can see the important role water is playing. So water is being released in the form of sweat or perspiration, and it's helping to reduce our body temperature. Okay, water is very important in many chemical reactions within our bodies, in particular the hydrolysis reactions, which helps to break down the macronutrients, breaks down the carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. So here we can see, as an example, here's our carbohydrate. Well, actually, it's a disaccharide, but it could be a polysaccharide. And by adding the water, it helps to break down the disaccharide or the polysaccharide down into its subunits, being the monosaccharide glucose. In the second example, we're seeing the hydrolysis of a protein. So the protein is actually broken down into its components, again, this time being amino acids. Okay, some other important functions of water is it acts as a lubricant. So inside our digestive system, we produce mucus, which is mainly water, and that allows the passage of food through that digestive system. Acts as a lubricant around various joints. So in this example here, we can see our knee joint surrounded by water there. Water is also acting as a shock absorber. So here we can see the brain surrounded by a layer of water. Also in our eye sockets, and also if a pregnant lady around the placenta protecting the embryo. Okay, so if we want to prevent problems such as dehydration, heat stroke, kidney stones, and other problems, we need to maintain the correct water balance. So every day we need to consume about 2.5 litres of water. So we want to make sure that the water is in balance, so that the same amount is coming in as the amount going out. Okay, in a hospital, a patient's water balance is carefully monitored to make sure that the water coming in and the water coming out is actually in balance. All right, so here's our water intake. So every day we should be consuming about 2.5 litres of water. So most of that, up to 1.5 litres, is coming in through actually drinking water and drinking other beverages, whether it's tea, coffee, soft drinks, whatever it might be. A large amount is actually coming in via the food that we're consuming, so up to 1 litre from food, particularly fruits and vegetables. So some of those are 95% water. And then lastly, through metabolism. So there's various chemical reactions that will release water, and we can get up to 300 mils of water via these reactions. So we've got this table here showing various contents of various foods. So you can see, as I mentioned before, particularly the fruits and vegetables can be very high in water. So we see here lettuce and tomato, 95% water, and the watermelon, 91% water. Okay, so this figure of 2.5 litres per day is an average recommended water intake. So in that table below, we can see on average, men need a little bit of water, more water than females, as the males have a higher basal metabolic rate. And obviously, if the person is very active, so athletes might actually need up to 4.5 litres per day, as compared to the average person that requires about 2.5 litres per day. Okay, to ensure you're getting your average of 2.5 litres per day, the recommendations are that you're consuming sufficient beverages, particularly water, juices, making sure you're getting enough fruits and vegetables, avoiding diuretics such as caffeine and alcohol. And the other thing you do is actually check the colour of your urine. So various health departments around the world have produced these colour charts to help us work out whether we're correctly hydrated. So what you're looking for is a pale yellow colour, which will indicate that we're correctly hydrated. A dark yellow will actually indicate that you're starting to become dehydrated. All right, so every day we're losing about 2.5 litres of water every day. Most of that we can see is coming from the urine, 1.5 litres. 700 mils from insensible perspiration and exhaled hair. So this insensible perspiration is just water that's evaporated from the skin, but it's not actually coming through your sweat glands. And then the water actually coming through the sweat glands, perspiration, that's accounting for 200 mils, and then via the feces, about 100 mils. All right, so your water losses can be affected by things such as environmental conditions, so things like temperature, humidity, altitude, and also the person's physiological condition. So if they're suffering some sort of infection, for example, they might be having fever, vomiting, diarrhea, which will result in greater water loss. If they're doing vigorous exercise, again, greater water loss. Lifestyle practices, so this will include consuming alcohol, various drugs, diuretics, will also affect water loss. Okay, we've got diuretics. These are substances that will increase water urine, which will result in greater water loss. Two of the most common diuretics are caffeine, pretty high in coffee, also relatively high in tea and some energy drinks. Alcohol is also a diuretic. So these substances will inhibit your antidiuretic hormones, resulting in greater water losses. So consuming excessive alcohol can result in both water loss and hangovers, and these hangovers are thought to be as a result of dehydration of the brain. So we can see here a typical person consists of something like 60% water, and of that 60% water, about 2/3 or 65% is located within our cells, and the rest, 1/3 or 35%, is located surrounding the cells, the extracellular fluid. So in this diagram, we can see the intercellular fluid. So remember 65% or 2/3 of the water's inside our cells, and the rest of the water, the extracellular water, is located outside of the cells, either surrounding the cells or forming part of the fluid within the blood vessels. You please view this video, which discusses the importance of fluid balance and the role of electrolytes in fluid balance. Electrolytes are minerals which are either positively charged or negatively charged, and what these electrolytes do is control the movement of water between and within cells. And of those electrolytes, it's the sodium that has the greatest effect. So we can see positively charged sodium, potassium, negatively charged chlorine, phosphorus. And what they do is attract water. So the minerals, they don't move easily across the membrane. So instead, it causes the water to then move across the membrane. So inside the cell, we've got mainly potassium and phosphorus, and outside the cell, we've got mainly sodium and chlorine. So inside the cell, we've got a slightly negative charge, and outside the cell, we've got a slight positive charge. So our cells try to keep the potassium in, this slight green colour, and try to keep the sodium out, this purpley colour. So the cell can't rely on normal diffusion because it's trying to move against the concentration gradient. So what it needs to do is activate the sodium-potassium pump, which actually requires energy in the form of ATP. So energy is consumed to pump out the excess sodium and to draw in the required potassium. So the end result is we've got a higher concentration of potassium inside the cell and a higher concentration of sodium outside of the cell. So water is going to move by process of osmosis, a type of diffusion, to areas that contains high concentrations of minerals or electrolytes. So it's these electrolytes that help control the movement of water in and out of the cells. Here's an example of water movement by osmosis. So in sample B, we've added the electrolyte, this time being sodium, which causes the water to move by osmosis from low concentration of sodium to the higher concentration of sodium. If you could please follow these links to view an animation of the sodium-potassium pump, and also a second one, an animation of the process of osmosis. So these electrolytes help maintain the correct water balance, making sure our cells remain healthy in this isotonic state. If we have too much water and not enough electrolytes, we could end up with a hypertonic state, and we can see that's going to damage the cells, they'll burst. Or if we've got too much electrolytes and not enough water, we can end up in a hypertonic state, and here we can see the cells are dehydrated. All right, so a quick look at these electrolytes. First one being sodium, it's an important electrolyte, helps maintain water balance, helps maintain correct blood pressure, correct pH balance, important for nerve transmission, and involved in transport of some nutrients. Our sodium intake should be around 500 micrograms and no more than 2,300 micrograms. But unfortunately, in our Western diet, we're often consuming more than 3,500 micrograms per day. Now, most of this excess sodium is coming through a variety of processed foods. So these graphs are telling us that most of our sodium is coming from various processed foods. So you can see 77% coming from either processed food or restaurant food. Very small amount of sodium coming from food that you're preparing at home. So at the top here, we've got, if you like, food that's prepared at home. Tends to be fairly high in potassium and relatively quite low in sodium, which is what we actually want, because we need lots of potassium inside our cells and trying to remove excess sodium. Whereas the processed version of the same foods is much higher in sodium and much lower in potassium. Now the food manufacturers are adding this excess sodium because it enhances the taste, and also sodium actually works as a food preservative. Now, having too much sodium is a potential problem because it has been associated with increased risk of hypertension, stroke, and heart disease. Okay, lacking sodium is also potentially a problem because it can cause things like muscle cramps, dizziness, shock. Now, being deficient in sodium is unlikely unless a person has been sick for a very long time and maybe vomiting, diarrhea, so losing a lot of fluid and a lot of electrolytes, or they've been doing excessive exercise and again losing a lot of water and electrolytes through the exercise. So this graphic here is just showing the link between excessive sodium and the risk of hypertension, and also been linked to some types of cancer as well. So if we're consuming too much sodium, what could potentially happen is you tend to retain too much water, which will tend to increase your blood pressure, leading to hypertension and then possibly other problems such as cardiac disease and also stroke. Please view this video, which discusses the link between excessive sodium and the development of hypertension. Okay, if you could please also view the second video, which discusses the DASH diet, which is designed to reduce the risk of hypertension. Okay, we're going to look at chloride next. So chloride's a negative ion, normally found outside of the cell, normally associated with sodium, is sodium chloride or potassium chloride, found as part of the stomach acid in the form of hydrogen chloride, and often found in table salts. Okay, the last electrolyte we're looking at is potassium. You can see a list of functions here. It's important again for the balance of fluid in the body, and also to balance out the other electrolyte, sodium. It's important for muscle contractions, transmission of nerve messages. Having a high potassium intake will help actually lower your blood pressure. The recommended intake, so the adequate intake, adults, something in the range of 3,500 to 4,700 micrograms per day. Okay, for sources of potassium, we saw in the previous slide that processed foods are normally pretty low in potassium and high in sodium. So we want to be avoiding those processed foods and eat some of the fresh foods or home-cooked foods. So things like the fresh fruits and vegetables, whole grains, are all a good source of potassium. Okay, I'm going to finish off with this last slide. It's telling us it's unlikely that potassium is going to become toxic because the kidneys get rid of the excess, and it's very unlikely that you'll be deficient because it's pretty common in various foods, particularly the fruits and vegetables. But it could actually happen in some patients that have got kidney disease or abusing use of alcohol or use of laxatives. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.